Hello and welcome to another episode of the Frankly Leader podcast. I am really excited today to have the fabulous Kate Smith with me. Kate, welcome to the podcast.
So much for having me.
Thank you for being available and wanting to come on. I'm really excited for this conversation. So for people who don't know Kate Smith, Kate Smith helps leaders build the kind of workplace we all want to work in, one where people actually thrive. As a consultant, coach and facilitator, Kate partners with organisations to create cultures of healthy growth. She believes ethical, people-centred workplaces shouldn't be rare. Agree? They should be everywhere. Her approach is simple. Really listen to what you need, then equip your leaders with the mindset and the skills to empower their teams. And that has given us a little clue as to the topic that we're going to talk about. So what's your topic that you're bringing today, Kate?
So the topic that I'm bringing today is mindset, because I think it's such a powerful agency for change at all levels. It was when I was first learning how to coach, and this was a long time ago, and I was introduced to the idea of coaching, and which blew my mind, by the way, as a leader. This idea of coaching just completely changed the way that I thought about leadership and leading others. And as part of that training, they talked about beliefs and how what drives our behavior most of the time actually is a belief. And a belief is simply a thought that we have that doesn't actually have any evidence. The whole sort of idea of being freed up by recognizing how our minds work and how if we just simply reframe or change the way that we think, suddenly that opens up whole new possibilities and opportunities for us at an individual and at a team at an organisational level. So you can tell I absolutely love it.
Definitely.
I just think it's a massive liberator.
And you had me at the word freedom and autonomy and agency. I was like, I'm in. When you realise you become what you think, so your thoughts create your reality. I think you said earlier, like your thoughts create your reality. But when you realise that you have agency and control over those thoughts so that you can choose a different reality, like you're a lot freer, aren't you, you have more choice, which I think, who doesn't want that? Like, who doesn't want that? And I remember a friend of mine using an NLP technique in this sense. And it's one of those things I'm never going to forget. She used to say, are you looking at life through your Elton John glasses, or are you looking at life through the difficult glasses? And so then I had this like amazing creative vision in my head about these fabulous, I'm going to look at life through the most fabulous lenses I can possibly have. And what difference would that do to your brain, which I just love.
Yeah, like you say, it's such a visual way of thinking about the lens through which we look at life, right? And a lot of the things that we just take for granted, the way the world works, we take for granted. We kind of assume that, well, this is the way the world works and we're just going to have to put up with it, which of course you and I know isn't the case. And the way that we've been brought up, it sort of creates a lot of deep-seated beliefs about kind of, ourselves and the world around us, etc. So there's a lot to unpack there. I watched a TED Talk years ago, and I honestly can't remember who the lady was. She was a psychotherapist, and she was talking about this invisible cage that we have around ourselves where we feel trapped and stuck, and we don't realise that most of the time that stuckness is actually down to the way that we're thinking about things. And it's easier said than done, for sure. Sometimes it's instant, and people immediately will just reframe or change the way that they're thinking, and that's really easy. And then some things are more difficult
more complex
to change, but still that agency, that freedom, that liberty is incredibly powerful.
Very much. So we're talking about mindset and beliefs. So in the context of the leadership realm, what do you think the biggest challenge is for leaders?
I mean, I think certainly in terms of what I'm hearing, and I'm guessing you're probably hearing the same. I think stress and overwhelm, just simply the pace at which organisations are now kind of operating at is I think it's unheard of. I mean, I haven't worked in an organisation now for getting on for 7 years, and even in that time it definitely feels like things are just operating at maximum all of the time. So I think there's some organisational stuff which I can come back to, and which I think contextually is really putting a lot of pressure on leaders. But I think certainly at an individual leadership level, I think one of the most important areas is thinking about how do you think about leadership, and what mindset do you have around what actually a leader is. What I tend to notice is that a lot of leaders, not through any fault of their own, the way that they've been brought up in the kind of employment world, and actually literally brought up from a child, is that a lot of leadership is quite parental. What I call parental, it's not my phrase, it's from
Mm.
transactional analysis. And this idea that, we're there to kind of, either nurture and look after our team and kind of rescue them and make sure they're okay, or we're there to kind of control and, sort of tell them what to do and make sure that they're behaving well, etc. And both of those ways of thinking about leadership are unhelpful, because what you end up with is a team which is in some shape or form reliant upon you. They're relying on you to either tell them what to do or to basically rescue them. And I think in this world, what we need is teams that take on more responsibility, are more accountable, are able to deal more with problems rather than it sitting all on the shoulders of the leader. So where it kind of manifests itself is in things like difficulty in delegating, because leaders have beliefs about their team, either, oh, I don't want to delegate because I don't want to put on them, they're already stressed enough as it is, or I don't want to delegate because I don't think they're going to do it right, or they're not going to do it in the
Mm.
way I would want to do it, or whatever those beliefs and assumptions are. It kind of sort of creates this cycle where the leader is not empowering their team to take on more stuff. And actually, that then ends up obviously with the leader kind of being stressed and overwhelmed themselves, and actually missing out on a lot of development opportunities and areas for the team. And so thinking about, okay, so how do I create more of an adult to adult relationship with my team and actually encourage that amongst themselves so that we all feel empowered, we all are upskilled, we're all able to problem solve and come up with solutions and come up with creative ideas, and we collaborate together better. And what we need is to unleash the potential of every single person in that organisation. And whilst they are either they're waiting to be told or they're waiting to be rescued, that's not going
Yeah.
to unleash the potential of those people.
And that
And it's
speaks to
not good
me
for
of,
them either,
yeah, I
actually.
was just thinking that how our workers are different now. Like the people who
Yeah.
go to work are different. They have different needs to what they had back then. Like, and we're not just a human resource anymore. And I was thinking about particularly the younger generations, but I also think it's true for older generations still in employment that people want more meaning, don't they? They want connection, they want relationship generally. They want more meaning from the work that they do. That requires a different kind of leadership, a different kind of leadership mindset.
Like, you are so right. And
Yeah.
and I often talk to leaders about, how society has changed and how leadership has had to change, because ultimately organizations and leadership are a mirror of society, aren't they? But they're often a little bit behind, because and again, change is an issue in a lot of organizations, and often we don't like change and we resist it, and that's just the way we've always done it, etc. And you're so right that if you think about 40 years ago being what, in 86 or whatever it is, oh my God, like that feels like years ago, doesn't it? But the world was very different, because the people in the workplace then were brought up with that kind of hierarchical command and control. This is the way society was, never mind like how work was. Whereas now things are, for good or for ill, a little bit more liberal. People are more conscious about the impact that they want to have, not just on
Mm.
their own careers and their own lives, but on, the environment and the wider world. And thankfully, and particularly the younger generation, are looking for work which, yes, pays well and is fulfilling from a potential point of view, but also has a purpose beyond that. And I think that's where a lot of organizations are potentially struggling with things like recruitment and retention, because whilst I think it's easy to blame Gen Z and kind of and the next generation that will be coming through soon, which is Generation Alpha, we can say, oh well, they're entitled and they expect this and that and the other, and massive generalization mindset issue there. But ultimately, I think it is an amazing thing, and it can only be a positive thing in the world if what they want is to work for an organisation that has got a purpose beyond profit.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, what are we all doing it for? So I agree, and I think leadership will either be forced to change in order to attract and retain that younger workforce and keep them happy, or they will struggle.
Yeah.
Because it is becoming more and more outdated to have that kind of leadership mindset, which is I'm in charge and you will just do what I say.
What are those challenges that leaders end up tolerating?
I think in terms of kind of going back to this idea about stress and overwhelm, where does that come from? I think it comes from a number of places. I think some of it is within themselves. I don't want to look like I can't cope. I don't want to look like I'm a failure. I want to be seen as successful and like I'm capable and all that kind of stuff. So I think some of that is ego, and I mean that in the kindest possible way,
Yeah.
because I also do a lot of work with leaders on ego. What bit of this is you and what bit of this is your ego. But I think a lot of it is organizational context. And I think that pace that I was talking about earlier on, which is pushing people to deliver more with less, which is essentially what most leaders are being asked to do in all sectors, comes from a belief. And that belief is much greater than the organization itself. It's an economic belief, which is we have to grow year on year. We have to keep growing. And that economic belief has been around for decades. It's an old one, but it's still very prevalent within our current psyche. Now, what that then means is that, well, that means that if we're doing more with less, then that creates more stress, it creates more pace. People, when they're stressed, create poorer decisions. Their behavior is poorer
Mm.
because they're stressed, and that's not their fault. And therefore, that creates a culture which isn't particularly a healthy one to work within. So it has a ramification, just this very single belief, which is, well, we're here to grow because that's what business is. That's what organizations do. We grow year on year. And I think challenging that, and some won't be able to because of the way that they're owned and the way that they're invested in, but I think where organisations can actually challenge that really fundamental assumption, why do we need to grow year on year?
Mm.
What, and this is where I've come up with this idea about healthy growth, because in
Mm.
nature, when we think about nature, nothing grows forever except cancer. Actually, that's the only thing that grows exponentially. So other than that, nothing in nature grows year on year on year on year. There's a book that I read a few years ago that absolutely blew my mind, and it's called Sapiens. An incredible book, and again, it blew my mind. It was an absolute game changer for me, because I was like, oh my god, money is a belief. Money doesn't exist, it's a belief.
Yeah.
The economic environment is a belief
A
that we've
construct.
created. And so, when we think about mindset and we think about, okay, well, what's causing this stress for leaders and what's causing them to lead in the way that they're leading, etc., it's a belief. It's another layer of belief below the individual ones, which is, well, we have to grow year on year, and because otherwise we failed. Well, do we? And I
Mm.
think challenging some of the assumptions around the organizational mindset, because I don't know about you, Jennifer, but I certainly am finding that no matter how much leaders want to grow themselves and their skill set, and they want to do the right thing for their teams, and they want to be better, and they recognize the benefits of, you know, coaching and emotional intelligence and moving into that adult to adult kind of relationship that I've mentioned, what I often hear is leaders saying, but my organization puts too much pressure on me. That's not the way it is here. I can't do that here,
Mm.
and so that context that they're sitting in is
Mm.
really, really influential for them.
And I think belonging plays big in this space. Like, I think that this is a really complex, testy topic. I'm relieved that there are examples of organisations, big ones like Patagonia, big brands that are actually looking at what is an organisation and what is like strong purpose-driven organisation, who actually sign their whole company over to the planet. Like radical stuff, and that all their profits go into doing good. I'm relieved that there's examples of people breaking the mold, and donor economics is another economic model which I think we can take a lot of inspiration from at an organizational level. But we are at the beginning of that shift, aren't we? I think. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but we're only just starting to see. We've not reached a tipping point yet. We're in early adopter territory.
Mm.
And I think that the challenge with that is that a lot of busy leaders and busy business owners look around at what everyone else is doing, and it's too easy to get swept up in, well, this is just what everyone does, right? Because
Yeah.
that's another mindset choice on one
Oh,
level.
without a doubt. I mean, I spent 20 years working in organizations, large corporates, and it never occurred to me that business would be done in any other way and that the economy would work in any other way other than how it did. And as you quite rightly say, there is a small, very small, but quickly growing movement of organizations who have realized that actually you can do both. You can have a purpose which is beyond profit, whether that's an environmental purpose, whether it's a societal purpose, in some way having a positive impact beyond the organization, and also make money. And actually, going back to the white paper, what I've discovered, because I've interviewed 20 leaders from 20 different organizations, the ones that are doing things differently from the business as usual are the ones that are actually the most successful and have the least challenges. They're not the
Mm.
biggest, but big isn't always better. And actually,
Well,
it's how you grow that's more important than the speed in which you grow.
yes, yes. I think people will be listening to this going, well, if they're not looking at growth, what are their measures of success? Have you got
Great
some
question.
examples you could share for people listening?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, without breaking sort of confidentiality, but the measures of success are those kind of more systemic impacts. So it might be increased biodiversity. Diversity, it might be, increasing environmental, positive environmental impact, whatever that might be. It might be kind of rewilding, or it might be, or it's increased societal impact. So it could be,
Mhm.
helping young people to get into work. So what's interesting is that in a traditional organization, the measure of success is money. End of.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a financial KPI. It could be
And
return on
position in the
investment.
market.
Sorry, which is a fact, which by the way is a finite mindset. So this is
Mhm.
another mindset which people have, which is that, and there's a really great. I'm a massive fan of Simon Sinek, and he's written a book a few years ago called The Infinite Game,
Yeah.
where he talks about how business usually sees the world that they're in as a finite game with a no number of players, and we're all fighting for market share. And what he points out is, well, it's not a finite game, it's an infinite game, because actually you don't know how many players are there. They're not all measuring success in the same way. One might be measuring profit, one might be measuring market share, one might be measuring dividends. So it's an absolute fallacy. But what these organisations are doing is they understand the importance of money and commerciality as a means to an end, not in an end in itself. So
Mm.
where a lot of organisations that traditionally do good, they have a very worthy purpose, but a lot of the time they see money as an unpleasant, almost, it's almost like they're slightly anti-capitalist. But we don't want to get involved in commercials because that's like the evil side of, we don't want to get involved there. We just want to do nice, good things. But the problem with that is that then they are not having the impact that they can have because they're not commercially viable enough. Whereas what these organisations that are doing, they've got this lovely mix. They've got a purpose, which is what they measure their success on.
Mm.
How are we creating a better world for the future beyond our own organisation and beyond our own generation? But how do we then use commerciality and money to make that happen and to make sure that
Mm.
the impact that we have goes way beyond ourselves, the organisation, and our own generation?
I know we're talking about mindset at the moment on three levels. We're talking about it at a leader level, me as a leader. We're talking about the leader then and their impact on their team. But we're also talking about it systemically at an organisational level. And I'm thinking actually it's about legacy, which you could apply to each of those three levels. What's the legacy that an organisation wants to have beyond its existence once the tree is felled and it's lived its 100 years or whatever, as you say, nothing grows forever. What's the legacy of the team working together and the impact they want to have? And then what's the legacy of the leader? So what kind of leader do they want to be? And therefore, what mindset do I need to hold? And what beliefs do I need to have about what's possible here?
I think again that's a really fundamental question that a lot of organisations doesn't occur to them to ask themselves, which is, well, what is our legacy? Because if our legacy is, well, we've basically delivered it, profit to our shareholders, so what? So what?
So is
But if our
everybody else.
legacy is we've actually made the world a better place through the practices and actions that we've taken as an organisation, whilst we have made some profit, great.
I like what you said then about actually a step to better sometimes is just saying make money, but make your money do good. Like, because yeah, you need to grow and be healthy. You need to have profit to grow and be healthy, but do it just by starting to think about your purpose and how you can use some of it to do more good with. That
Yeah,
would be a great
yeah.
first step. And that's brought me back to an individual leader listening to this, going, right then, I can only
Mm.
take responsibility for me. So as a leader in with my mindset, what's the one tip that you would say to a leader today to help them work on the mindset muscle, and take it to the gym? What would you give them as a tip?
I love that. The mindset muscle. I love that.
Mm.
So the one tip I think, one very, very simple question. What assumptions am I making right now? What assumptions am I making right now?
Mm.
Because so often what the brain does is it will see something, it will take information in, and then it interprets it. And it interprets it based on, previous experiences, beliefs, previous, existing mindsets that we have. And that gets us into all sorts of trouble, whether it is observing somebody's behavior and then kind of translating that into a judgment. So, oh, they're sloppy, or they don't have a work ethic, or they're a pain, or whatever it might be. So that's an assumption. Or whether it's an assumption about decisions, so a lot of decision making, as we know, scientifically is massively flawed through a lot of biases that I find absolutely fascinating and hilarious at the same time.
Yeah.
So again, making a decision, what assumptions am I making? So whatever it is, whether it's just going through your day to day kind of, or even how you're feeling, sometimes, we feel irritated or we feel frustrated and, often it's because something's happened, maybe somebody's looked at us in a funny way or they didn't quite kind of listen to us properly in a meeting. And again, boom, your mind's off and it's like, oh, well, they obviously don't like me or, what I said was rubbish or whatever it is, and we're so quick to kind of judge
Yeah.
ourselves or others. And again, it's an assumption. So what are the facts? What do you
Yeah.
actually know for a fact? And what's your brain made up? And it's really hard. I love that mindset muscle phrase,
Yeah.
Jennifer, because it takes a lot of practice to challenge your own mind because it
Yeah.
doesn't want to be challenged.
Yeah.
It wants status quo, it wants everything to be easy. And I think really focusing on, from an inner growth point of view, really developing yourself is about understanding how your mind works, why it's doing what it's doing, and how can I make that more helpful for me and for others. So yeah,
Yeah.
what assumptions am I
What
making?
assumptions? I love that. My version of that is, what's the story you're telling yourself about what
Yeah,
that means, Jennifer
yeah,
Potter?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, totally. What's exactly, what is that story that you're telling yourself?
Yeah.
That
And is it
literally
true?
your brain's just made up.
Yeah. And is it
Yeah.
true?
And is it true?
And is it
What
true?
evidence do you have?
Yeah. Oh, we could go on. The other thing that was popping for me was that we teach the 7 stage model a lot in our work with leaders. And of the 7 stages, which is a model for navigating change, but in relationship with others, one of the stages that I always say people like hop over, skip over, avoid the most is clarification. So they take on what they've heard, they tell themselves a story about what they mean, they have their own interpretation. 5 other people in that meeting room all have their own interpretation of what you've all agreed to, but nobody thinks to clarify if you're all on
Yeah.
the same page and you've got the same story in your head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you are so, so right. And that's the thing is, you've got to recognize that not only are you making a load of assumptions, but everybody around you is also making a load of assumptions. And
Yeah.
I'm really interested in language actually, because I find that language has a lot to answer for in terms of what we think we mean, what somebody else then hears, how they then interpret that. It's fraught with error. It's fraught with error.
Mhm.
And so thinking about the generalizations that people make, the deletion, how they delete information. So to your point, when you're sitting there thinking that you've all got clarity and then wondering afterwards why it's all gone a bit wrong or why somebody didn't deliver what they, it's all down to assumptions. Did we
Mm.
actually clarify and state clearly what we all have understood from that conversation?
Yeah.
And again, it's a skill, and this is why skill set and mindset really work well together. The skill set comes in things like listening really attentively, asking curious questions, looking for clarity.
Mm.
That's a skill set that supports the mindset. The two have to work together.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
think it starts with mindset because you have to recognize, first of all, that your mind is not necessarily sometimes helping you.
Yeah, it's hardwired, isn't it, the brain to keep you safe and to help you belong. But belonging doesn't necessarily help you act with integrity, nor does it help you grow either. I'm wondering, are there any resources or books that you really like in this field?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but in terms of me and my mind management, the one that I would always go back to is the Chimp Paradox
Ah,
by Professor Steve Peters, because I think what he does, and I still use it in the work with leaders around understanding how your brain works, is really understanding those different parts of the brain and when one's in charge and how, not dangerous, but how unhelpful that can be. So
mm,
that would always be a go-to one. The other classic, of course, and again, it's an oldie but a goodie, is Emotional Intelligence by Daniel.
and a Goleman.
Yes, it is Daniel Goleman. I was going to say no, it's not Daniel Goleman, but it is Daniel Goleman. Yeah, it is Daniel Goleman. Yeah. So yeah, and again, it just really explaining this idea about how emotions occur and how the different parts of the brain kind of operate, but in both in a really accessible way.
All that's left to say is I think you need to come back because there's 3 more episodes we could deep dive into. So let's assume that we've given our listeners a taster today. And just to say thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving up your time and sharing so entertainingly and insightfully and wisely. Like, I've loved it. It's been great. So thank
It's
you.
been such a pleasure, Jennifer, as always. Thank you so much.